he was privy to all sorts of classified meetings and information. And when COVID-19 first hit, most Americans do not at that point realize how bad things are without sounding the alarm for the average American, right? Richard Burr started dumping stock in things like Wyndham Hotels. We're talking like hundreds of thousands of dollars of stock, but here's where it gets even worse. Richard Burr calls his brother-in-law. Within 1 minute of hanging up the phone, the brother-in-law calls his broker and dumps like $100,000 worth of his stock.
Best investor in your state just might be your U.S. senator or congressperson. And that's because they can trade on insider information. Now, if you or I or Martha Stewart did it, well, we go to jail. But in Washington, D.C., it's perfectly legal. And that's why today we have what journalist Matt Lewis calls filthy rich politicians. That's the title of his new book, and we cover it today on Global Macro Update from Malden Economics. Matt, really appreciate you joining me today. Is our system just inherently corrupt right now? Is it broken?
I think it's definitely broken. You know, it's interesting. I do go back and look at the founding fathers of this country who I think created a great nation. They were aware of the problems of corruption. But I think it's incumbent upon us to adapt with the times and to have reforms. And I'm not somebody, I don't believe in the perfectibility of man. I don't think there's any reform that's going to, quote unquote, fix this problem or solve these problems. But I do think that what we can do is sort of understand and recognize human nature and try to mitigate some of the worst corruption, right? So my theory is that, there's data in the book to back this up. It's not just anecdotal, but very clearly over the last 3 or 4 decades, trust in elected officials and institutions has declined. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But it seems like, looking at the data, one of the reasons is the sense that the game is rigged and that members of Congress and elected officials care more about their own personal advancement, including their own finances, than they care about us. Yes, I think that as things stand, it will get worse until we make some serious reforms.
It was a reminder for me why people are so angry right now. Congress has never been more wealthy, and politicians, not just Congress, presidents as well, they've never been more wealthy. And a lot of that wealth gets created while they're in office.
Yes.
Which is kind of shocking.
Definitely. And as I say, the book is about how the rich get elected and the elected get rich. And I tell both stories, but I think the latter part of the equation, the elected getting rich, is much more corrosive to our country and to trust in elites and institutions. Look, right now, the average member of Congress is about 12 times richer than the average American household. And I think it's always been the case that politicians were somewhat richer than the average person. Certainly presidents and U.S. senators were richer. But we're now at a point where members of the lower house, the House of Representatives, the house that's supposed to be dependent on the people, sympathetic with the people, the average member of the House is now a millionaire and has been for a few years. There is a big disconnect between kind of a chasm between politicians and the people who pay their salaries. And again, I think that in and of itself is concerning. But what makes it really bad is the sense that these politicians are using their job for like insider information and stock trading, the revolving door going into lobbying. Here's one that sounds innocuous, but actually isn't: book deals. A lot of them, in fact, Ron DeSantis literally just became a millionaire about 2 weeks ago because of a book deal. And then spreading the wealth around to their friends and family, which also looks very swampy. And most of these things are perfectly legal. Some of them might even have a decent explanation, but all of them contribute to what I would say the appearance of impropriety.
I think you called it honest graft.
Yes. I think it was a George Washington Plunkett. They described like dishonest graft is stealing from the treasury, But honest graft would be if you heard that there's a new highway coming in and you happen to buy property adjacent to that. That would be honest graft. And that's really what most of my book is about. It's politicians engaging in honest graft.
My audience being mainly investors, I think most of us know the most famous current example, which is the Pelosi family. Nancy Pelosi, more specifically her husband, who apparently is the best hedge fund manager on earth. If you were to look at his track record, has outperformed the market by multiples. But you point out that that's not really trading on insider information. It's not really new. It's not uncommon, and it's not limited to just Ms. Pelosi. It's rampant. Can you give us maybe another example or two, maybe one from the right, because you pick on both sides pretty well.
So to me, the most egregious example from a Republican is Richard Burr, who was a U.S. senator, is a U.S. senator, was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. So in that capacity, he was privy to all sorts of classified meetings and information. And when COVID-19 first hit here in America, when we first, before average Americans realized how bad it would be, like in early 2020, Richard Burr started dumping stock in things like Wyndham hotels, right? The kinds of things yeah. And we're talking like hundreds of thousands of dollars of stock he dumps in things like Wyndham hotels without sounding the alarm for the average American, right? Most Americans do not at that point realize how bad things are. But here's where it gets even worse. Richard Burr calls his brother-in-law. Within 1 minute of hanging up the phone, the brother-in-law calls his broker and dumps like $100,000 worth of his stock. And so once again, it can't prove that that's insider trading, but it certainly smells swampy. And of course, he was, he actually stepped down from being chair of the Intel Committee during an investigation, but there have been no arrests made, no penalties. Everything's hunky-dory.
Just speculating, but part of that is probably because of, if he gets in trouble for it, now the mirror gets shined around the room, and where does it stop? Yes,
and there were actually, as I recall, 3 other U.S. senators who were embroiled around the same time in controversies regarding COVID. One of them was Kelly Loeffler from Georgia, no longer a senator. I think one of them might have been Dianne Feinstein, senator from California. And yeah, I think that they say that the Senate is the most elite club in America. It's 100 of them. And I'm sure that there's really not much of an appetite to start investigating, looking too closely into this kind of activity.
What I found really interesting about your book was when you talk about, not all of them come in rich, and what a feat that is. Just how hard it is to get elected. Can you talk a little bit about what's up against the normal person getting elected?
I mean, I'll give you a story. I don't even think I'm a normal person anymore, but I couldn't get elected. So I'm sitting here in West Virginia. My wife is a Republican political fundraiser. And so she's raised money for a lot of big names and conservative Republican senators, attorneys general, congressmen, things like that. And about 6 months ago, or while I was writing this book, she and I went for a walk, and we were talking because in West Virginia, where I live, my congressman is running for the U.S. Senate seat against Joe Manchin. So there's a lot of open seats in West Virginia. There's an open House seat. And I was saying to my wife, if things were a little different right now, maybe I could run for that seat. Maybe I'd have a chance to be a congressman or something. And she's like, oh, no, you couldn't. And I'm like, well, and she's like, you wouldn't have enough money. And I said, well, I've been in the political journalism business for 15 years. I knew a lot of people. And I'm like, I'm married to a professional political fundraiser. And she said, well, if someone like you came to me and wanted to hire me, I would say, come back to me after you've either donated from your own, bank account, $300,000, or raised $300,000 from your personal network, like your Christmas card list. And if you could do that, then I will help introduce you to political action committees and donors and PAC or, super PACs and all that. And I'm like, I don't have $300,000 just sitting around to run for office, just, on the off chance that I might win. I couldn't even do it. So the average Joe Sixpack, very unlikely. And, even the politicians that we think of as being kind of regular folk, like look at, Marjorie Taylor Greene down in Georgia. She's a millionaire. She's worth like at least $5 million. We think of her as being kind of a blue collar person because of her persona. She's, in politics, she's considered a piker, but compared to like most Americans, she would be incredibly wealthy.
So you're one of those lucky few that gets elected without having a big bankroll and maybe not even having network of people that you trust that can help you. You probably have to rely on your friends and your family. They probably need to get paid. At what point does it go from paying a friend or family member fairly for services rendered to nepotism?
This is such an interesting thing, right? Because, one of Donald Trump and other rich candidates, one of their arguments is, I can't be bribed, elect me, I'm rich. I don't need, I don't need the money. I'm not going to steal. So it is interesting, right? That sort of working class people, on one hand, could be more susceptible to being seduced by the lifestyle. Like in the book, I talk about former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, who got elected in Virginia, got elected governor, very promising. And but he was hanging out with all of these rich donors, and he's sort of looking around. It's like, why don't I have a jet? And his wife wanted a designer dress to wear to the inauguration, and they were actually in debt, or they didn't have enough money. And so they started accepting gifts from donors, personal gifts, Rolex watches, things like that. And it ended up breaking up their marriage and destroying his political future. So it is an irony of, if you're not super rich, in a way it could make you susceptible to these temptations. You were talking about sort of the nepotism thing. One of the people in the book that I quoted is kind of an ethics expert, and he said, we find that if you want to bribe a politician, one of the best ways to do it is to hire their spouse. Just give their spouse a job and pay them well. And maybe they show up, maybe they don't, but that's a really good way to kind of bribe is probably a harsh word, but have influence over the politician. It's so hard nowadays. I mean, obviously, my wife is a career woman, very professional, very good at her job. How do you kind of police what spouses are doing? One thing that I write in the book, as you mentioned, I've got this final chapter of the book that's full of reforms. One of the things I would do to help this, to mitigate it, would be to ban politicians from hiring their families on their campaigns or in their congressional offices. So, for example, there's one of the things in my book, Ilhan Omar, who's a progressive Democrat, directed I think it was like $1 million or more to her husband's consulting firm. We have people like Maxine Waters, who's a Democratic congresswoman, who paid her daughter, I think it was $80,000 just in 1 year, 2020. Ron Paul, Republican from Texas, in 2012, when he was running for president, employed no less than 6 members of his family, paying them around $300,000 total. And so this certainly looks weird. It looks swampy. I don't think it's asking, look, you can still volunteer on the campaign, but we're just not going to pay you from the campaign coffers or from taxpayer dollars earmarked for office stuff.
There are so many reasons beyond not having an Ivy League degree that keep you from being an elected official if you're not rich.
Yes. And the big one is time. You alluded to this earlier. The main reason that working class people are not elected officials is that they don't run for office. And the main reason they don't run for office is not actually the money, it's that they don't have time to campaign. Because who could afford to take off 6 months to go door to door campaigning for state senate? And when there's no guarantee you're going to win. You might lose.
The revolving door you talk about. I didn't know 25% of congressmen and congresswomen join a lobbying firm after they're done. That was a shockingly high number to me.
Yeah, and it may even be a little higher. It's between a quarter and a third of members. Yeah, and those are only people who register as lobbyists. There are other people who essentially lobby, but they don't take on the name lobbyist. And then you've got, not only is there a revolving door where members of Congress, walk out of Congress one day and, I guess they do have like a year cooling off period, but essentially they can start lobbying their friends pretty quickly. Not only is that a way that they can keep cashing in, but there's also like foundations. It's not just the Clinton Foundation. Other politicians will start foundations. And then there is a kind of a new trend where politicians, it used to be, believe it or not, until I think until 1991 was the last person who was able to do this. It used to be that you could be a congressman, raise millions of dollars for your reelection campaign, but retire instead, and you used to be able to keep that money legally as your personal money. Now, that's no longer the case. You cannot do that anymore. But what you can do is you can raise millions of dollars and then decide not to run for reelection. And you can keep that money not personally, but in essentially what I would call a slush fund. So you can keep it to give out down the road to other candidates to sort of curry favor. You can keep it to travel, to visit with these candidates or go to like fundraisers that they're having at, I don't know, Sag Harbor, you name the place. And so you could really live a comfortable lifestyle for many years off of this cash that you've accrued for, by the way, somebody else's money who gave you the money ostensibly to get elected. It's not a bad gig if you can get it.
I want to hit you with some current events because there's some interesting things happening below the surface. For example, No Labels, this group that is, they're essentially a third party, but they're not calling themselves a third party, but they're threatening to run an alternative ticket, a unity ticket, which would be one moderate Republican and one moderate Democrat. And there's a lot that I find appealing about that. The thing that I think I find most appealing is that both parties are attacking No Labels with vigor, which makes me think, they must be onto something, and they must be scared by this third party threat.
I like it in principle. I mean, I like the idea of people who are not beholden to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and people who are like problem solvers. And who are not crazy. I like that idea. The problem I have is that the potential for them to play spoiler. And, whether you're rooting, by the way, I think it's probably going to be Trump versus Biden again, but who knows? But whether you're rooting for Trump or Biden, I think it's sort of like if you go to a World Series game or a Super Bowl, you don't want the referee or the umpire to mess up a call and change the outcome of the game because the stakes are so high. And just the idea that, like, I don't know, a third party candidate like a Joe Manchin, for example, from, West Virginia or whoever could, I mean, you got to realize the last two elections in 2016, the last two presidential elections, in 2016, Donald Trump won the Electoral College because he won 3 states by like 77,000 votes total. In 2020, Joe Biden won the presidency because he won 3 states by even less, I believe. I think it was like 40 some. So what bothers me is that you could have the outcome of this incredibly important presidential race determined by some weird external factor like, well, do you remember? I mean, we don't have to go. This is not a crazy thing, right? Well, Pat Buchanan probably accidentally cost Al Gore the 2000 election in Florida. Remember the butterfly ballot and all that. So I'm sympathetic with the concept of sort of independent third party candidates. But my concern is that really our system is a two-party system, and that some fluke could throw the election. And I think we have enough problems right now as it is.
I think the frustration on a lot of people's part is like they're not excited about either choice, because I think we're all feeling the same way, like you are, that it's going to be another Trump Biden. So like, ooh, great battle of the 80-year-olds. We're kind of done with that. A couple of months ago for a conference, I interviewed Andrew Yang and Frank Luntz. So you've kind of right and left. And they agreed that one of the best things we could do for this political system that we have would be to institute ranked choice voting. So you could vote for whoever you want. You could vote for your first choice, but if you were nervous about them being a spoiler, you could put for your second choice Trump or Biden, whichever one you lean towards. What do you think about ranked choice voting?
I would entirely support that. I would love to see that happen. And I would really like to see it happen even in the primary process. If political parties were to make that part of their primary selection process, because with ranked choice voting, you're more likely to have a candidate emerge who is a consensus candidate. And so I think that it would have one effect that would be less fringe candidates winning. So I think it would be very healthy. And we've seen it play out in different states, I think, like in Alaska, for example. And, maybe there's some unintended consequences that could emerge from this, but we've testing this out, the laboratories of democracy in the states, and the places that I've seen it, it seems like it works pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be, I think it would go a long way to bringing this country and its people, real people, not the politicians, but the real people back together.
And you wouldn't have to, obviously you wouldn't have to worry about the spoiler effect of maybe I want to vote for the no labels party, but I'm afraid that I'm going to swing the election to one of the other people I hate, so I'm not going to do it. So it would definitely allow us to potentially have a different option.
The spoiler objection is interesting to me. I understand your point, but what I find interesting is that both parties are saying the same thing, that they're both worried that no labels could be a spoiler that impacts them negatively. That's what I find intriguing.
It is. And honestly, I feel like if I was Donald Trump, I would probably be rooting for this. I think it's more likely to hurt Biden than it is to hurt Trump. But maybe they see something I don't, which is interesting.
What else could actually get done that might help us remember in this country that we have more in common with each other than not?
Well, the most important thing, I think, is to ban stock trading. I'm also for term limits. I used to be against term limits. I'm now for them. And one of the reasons I think it would mitigate the ability for someone to come to Congress and basically make generational wealth and really exploit the system. There's a lot of reforms in the book, and to make up for it, believe it or not, I actually support raising the salary of members of Congress. I don't want them profiting on the stock market. I don't want them making millions off of book deals. I don't want them hiring their families. I don't want them going into lobbying. So my book proposes a lot of ways that will cut down on their ability to make money outside of their jobs. And so I like to pay them a little more to actually focus on we the people.
I remember reading when I was a kid, reading Tip O'Neill's book. Back in the day when it was him and a younger Gingrich, and they all lived together. Like they all. It was expensive even back then to be in D.C. And so they all got apartments together. And so when you live, if you're a Republican and you live with a Democrat, like you fight all day long. It's like that old cartoon, right, with Wile E. Coyote and the sheepdog, right? They're friends when they clock out.
They clock out, like look at their watch, go have a beer, that kind of thing. Well, yeah, like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill used to drink, have a beer together, and it was one of them said we're all friends after 5 o'clock, and those days are gone, sadly.
Yeah, they are.
And I try to keep it alive in the punditry / columnist world. It's a little bit better, but it's still, it's the polarization has changed, and everything now is viewed as a moral struggle. It's not just a disagreement of opinion. And so, it used to be you could even go on TV and argue with someone of a different political persuasion and then go have a beer later. Still happens, but now some of them are like, no, if you voted for that guy, you're evil. It's not just that you're wrong, it's that you're a bad, immoral person. And I like the old days better personally.
If you want to know why environmental, social, and governance-focused funds don't do well for your IRA or the environment, check out my conversation with former BlackRock exec Terrence Keeley.